Yeah, and people assume a lot of times, like, when the church gets bigger, it's like somehow easier to step out in faith, or because you have more resources or something, like, but it's like, man, as soon as you get comfortable with, this size budget or this size church or this amount on my shoulders in terms of a leader, like, as soon as that kind of becomes the norm, the next place God's going to take you, you have to go through that journey again. Like you gotta step out in faith again. It's like you can't use the faith from 6 months ago or a year ago, and that's good.
Yeah, I mean,
that's where God wants us to be.
Absolutely, because that idol of comfort is just as prevalent as that idol of like, man, I want to grow. Because it's when you don't have anything. The idol of comfort doesn't really exist. The idol of comfort comes in later when you have been blessed. And I mean, that's the scary verse in the Bible, Hosea 13, is like, just that idea of, man, when you were in the pasture and I had given you rest, that's when you forgot me.
Yeah.
And so, I think that I think many of us can face that in our personal life or whatever. You get a little bit older, you get a little bit better well off, you get a little bit, just kind of more space. Your kids aren't so young and crazy. I mean, as soon as you can breathe, it's like, all right, I'm just going to level off right here. My leadership, my church, just all of it. And you were really trying to call people away from that.
This is Breaking Barriers, where we help pastors and churches grow so that they can go.
Welcome to the Breaking Barriers podcast. I am Pastor Bobby, and I'm here with Pastor Andrew, and we have an exciting episode today. We're going to do something a little bit different. We just got done in the last couple of weeks with our Breaking Barriers conference, and man, it was so awesome. We had 53 different churches there, I think from 7 different states, and it was just really good to be able to connect with other leaders and hear about how God is working in their church, and also just get to learn from what other churches are doing. So today what we wanted to do is we just wanted to talk about, I think it's kind of a unique perspective to be able to be around all those different churches. And we just want to talk about kind of takeaways of what churches are learning, things that are going really well in other churches. And hopefully, man, this will just help you. Even if you came to the conference, sometimes when you lead something, you get a unique perspective because people come up to you and say, hey, this is really helpful, or this is what's happening in our church, or here's this really cool story. So we just want to talk about some different takeaways, and hopefully this will be very practical and value add for you. So one of the things I want to start with is we both did kind of talks at the conference, and I know we both got a lot of, different feedback. You did a talk on 6 myths about church growth. I had a bunch of people come to me and just talk about how helpful it was to them, how freeing the talk was to them. So I didn't know if you had any specific, kind of feedback or what people came up to you and talked about.
To add to what you said earlier about the unique perspective, the other thing that I thought was cool about the conference was, man, there were just people from different tribes too. I mean, we had different denominations. We had some guys that, from different church planting networks, not even just in North Carolina, but I mean, really all over. We had 7 states and that kind of thing. So
it kind of provides for like a cool spirit, like a cool ethos, like there's nothing wrong, cause we're in a denomination, like there's nothing wrong of having that like super theological tribe, but I don't know, something about being around a bunch of people that want to see God work in a big way in their church, and they want their church to grow. I don't know. There was just something unique about just the spirit of it all.
Yeah. I mean, I think like, the way I'm viewing sort of the Breaking Barriers tribe, it's not really a tribe, but just whatever it means to be growth oriented,
culture of it.
Yeah. And growing and going and all that. Ironically, I think that they dropped the pretense, which is funny because I think the anti-growth church movement would say that we would be the pretentious ones for talking about numbers and growth and all that. But when you get around these guys, I think you realize it's kind of the opposite. It's like, man, they've dropped the pretense of false humility and being scared to death of being part of a growing movement. They've acknowledged more of like, hey, we could all be susceptible to pride and even sinful pragmatism. I mean, that we could all like do things that aren't right in order to get the numbers up or whatever. So we got to watch that. We got to be okay. But man, we're not going to take that so far that we refuse to celebrate when God is just doing like awesome stuff. So, yeah, man, I think that talk you're talking about in particular, probably the biggest takeaway for me in terms of hearing feedback from that talk is just that there is a culture of and it really is like it's a set of sort of principles or beliefs. I mean, they're myths. That's why I called it that sort of undergird the entire anti-church growth world. And they're just pithy little lines. Mm-hmm. They're things about people that get baptized and then walking away from the faith, or there are things about multi-site, or there are things about, and what I tried to bring out was a lot of times those things sound really good from the conference stage. They almost feel convicting until you're willing to look at them like 1 inch deeper. And then you realize like, man, they just don't hold up scripturally. And so, example I used of that was a baptism. Like if people want to wait forever to baptize somebody, I'm not saying don't do that. What I am saying is you're a massive pragmatist if you do that.
Right.
What you've decided is practically we don't want to have to rebaptize people later, so we're going to depart from what we see in the book of Acts, and we're going to pragmatically implement some massive strategy of you got to go to these many hours of classes and walk with an elder for 17 months. And again, what's funny is I'm not saying that's wrong. Like I'm like, man, that's fine. I'm a pragmatist to the max, but like the way it's talked about sounds so pious. Like, oh, well, the problem with a big growing church is they baptize people who end up walking away from the faith. And so people immediately like, well, we don't want to do that. So let's jerk the wheel and go the other way. And then upon just, like I said, 1 inch deeper in scripture, you realize like, man, how many people walked away from the faith in the actual Bible, in the New Testament? It's like a lot, and Paul, and I've done a whole podcast on this. Paul names those people. In Hebrews, we're talked about, those people. There's different stories about those people. I mean, you think about the apostles baptizing Simon the sorcerer. I mean, they baptized him, and he walks away within like 10 minutes. And, Jesus in the parable of the sower and the 4 soils, and ain't but one of them good, and all this stuff, it's like actually is the normal expectation of the believer that we would see a lot of people profess but not follow all the way through. Mm-hmm. My point in bringing all that up is I think there were some people that there were moments like that where they thought, man, I heard something that sounded smooth and it sounded convicting and I kind of bought it. And then if you just look at it a little deeper, you realize it don't line up exactly with scripture. And so I think there were some people that got freed up in talking about trying to let the air out of some of those myths.
Yeah, I think one other thing from your talk, you kind of brought it up about the pragmatism stuff, is we did, I think it was on day 2, we did a podcast, like a live podcast, and after both of our talks, we got people sent in a bunch of questions and stuff, and even though I think, the majority of people at the conference were there, pro-growth already, a lot of people just kind of didn't know what to think about the pragmatism stuff that you did. Mm-hmm. Not because it doesn't make sense. I think maybe just people don't really think about it all that much, and or maybe the idea of doing things with like excellence or wisdom or just maybe has really been kind of like co-opted in a real negative way in kind of the anti-church growth movement. I could just tell like there were so many questions that came in that were just, I could tell people were wrestling with this idea of like, is that bad to be a pragmatist?
Yeah. I mean, it's funny because like what people do is they think that whatever level of pragmatics they currently employ, it's the next step in pragmatics that makes you a pragmatist.
Right.
So they don't view themselves as a pragmatist. It's like, they use church software systems and they do things that are highly practical and they send mailers out for Christmas. Which
have a website.
None of that is in the Bible. They don't view that as pragmatism. They just want the next step of whatever it is, So now it's like, yeah, but now you made Instagram and your church thing and that's pragmatic. And it's just like, come on, you got to have a little bit of analytical in you and just at least kind of see it for what it is. Yeah, what I brought out in that talk was, for example, like, man, there is no scriptural reason to circumcise Timothy, but Paul was insistent on doing that. It is absolutely a pragmatic issue. I think we're going to be more and better served and have less conflict in what we're trying to do if he just presents himself more like he's adhering to the law. So boom, let's do this. And I just think, man, I think Paul had that in his heart. Go to the city, it'll flow downhill. I mean, I think we can name a lot of things, I think, in his ministry that was pragmatic. And man, we're just trying to do pragmatism well. We all do it. Everybody does it. Everybody is a pragmatist. If you're in the church world, there's not one person I've ever met that is not a total pragmatist.
It's just like where you draw the line.
And do some people decide to do it to the glory of God, or do some people decide to feel shamed and icky and gross about it?
Mm-hmm.
You know?
Yeah, that's good. Yeah, I did a talk on Joshua 3. Very, very similar to what we talk a lot about at Mercy Hill and Breaking Barriers, just about preparing the jars. That concept comes from 2 Kings 4. Joshua 3, I had never taught or even heard a sermon on this. I'm sure other people had heard sermons on this before, but Joshua 3 is basically right before the people go into the promised land. They've been in the desert for 40 years. I mean, the journey has been so long, what God's been doing from Abraham into Egypt, slavery, out of Egypt. Now they're about to go into the promised land, and it's like, man, they're at the edge of the Jordan, and God tells them, hey, you're going to walk across on dry land, but he makes them get into the water first before the miracle happens. And I just really brought up in the talk, man, so many times when we're living for God's mission, there's just moments like that where God wants us to step out in faith before we actually see God move. It sounds real spiritual to kind of present it the opposite. Like, man, we're just waiting around for God to move, and we're just waiting on God. And it gets put in this real pious language, And what ends up happening is, if things are chaotic or crazy, it's like people assume that's not God's will. I would say sort of a feedback I got from the talk that I just thought was really interesting, and you and I both know this to be true. A lot of people brought up to me, like, how connected, you wanting the church to grow and how we have to step out in faith, how connected that is to just our individual personal, like, leadership. It's like, whatever God is doing in the heart of the lead pastor,
Right.
when it comes to, like, courage, fear, am I willing to step out in chaos? Like, am I willing to be the first to lead? Like, how connected that personal journey is with, like, leading the church into those things. I don't know if you had any thoughts about that.
No, I think that's right. I mean, even in my talk that I did over lunch, just with the lead pastors, it was interesting to me how quickly and how intrigued people were by the concept of, this is coming at a different angle, but they were in terms of personal flywheel, not just church flywheel in terms of growth of your church. Mm-hmm. But a lot of the questions I had after were more about, I had referenced, just that personal flywheel of breakthrough and trying to, become more courageous and healthier every year, that we can. And that really deeply resonated with people. And so I could see that in your talk, certainly how people would say, man, in my life, because I think you made the point, which I know we're not going back and redoing the talk, but I thought one of the strongest points was the water would have been chaotic at that time.
Right.
It's there's almost an illusion of Jesus speaking over the storm in that story. It's like there's this chaotic water, you got to step out, or Jesus or Peter walking on the water, and that chaos comes right before breakthrough, and I think that's true really in any area of our life. Larry Osborne said, I think it's really good kind of to your point on your talk, Larry Osborne is like, man, you can have comfort or you can have growth, but you cannot have both.
Yeah.
Right. If you're going to have growth, you're going to have chaos.
Right.
And, a lot of people just stop in their life with comfort. I mean, the second they can get comfortable, they just kind of stop. Their physical health doesn't grow anymore. Their mental acuity doesn't grow anymore. Their leadership doesn't grow anymore. What we're trying to be, I think, is a tribe at Breaking Barriers that's like, man, we need to be hungry for growth in every area of our life. God deserves us to be eyes up type people.
Yeah. Yeah. And people assume a lot of times, like, when the church gets bigger, it's like somehow easier to step out in faith, or because you have more resources or something, like, but it's like, man, as soon as you get comfortable with, okay, this size budget or this size church, or, this amount on my shoulders in terms of a leader, like, as soon as that kind of becomes the norm, the next place God's going to take you, you have to go through that journey again. Like you gotta step out in faith again. It's like you can't use the faith from 6 months ago or a year ago, and that's good.
Yeah, I mean,
that's where God wants us to be.
Absolutely, because that idol of comfort is just as prevalent as that idol of, like, man, I want to grow. Because it's the when you don't have anything, the idol of comfort doesn't really exist. The idol of comfort comes in later when you have been blessed. And I mean, that's the scary verse in the Bible, Hosea 13, is like, just that idea of, man, when you were in the pasture and I had given you rest, that's when you forgot me.
Yeah.
And so, I think that I think many of us can face that in our personal life or whatever. You get a little bit older, you get a little bit better well off, you get a little bit, just kind of more some space. Your kids aren't so young and crazy. I mean, as soon as you can breathe, it's like, all right, I'm just going to level off right here. My leadership, my church, just all of it. And you were really trying to call people away from that.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. All right. Hey, let's talk about like kind of 5 big takeaways just from being around some of these other churches. Like, not only do we have the conference, we had breakouts, and then we also just hanging out with people, talking during the sessions, hanging out at night with different people, just getting to hear about what God's kind of doing in different churches all over the place. So we'll kind of walk through these 5 of them. My first takeaway was, God, it seems like these principles of growth and having this like heartfelt desire in a good way to want to see your church grow, and instituting some of these, basic principles around this stuff, it seems like it's having an effect in like all different size churches. I would say for you and I both, some of the most encouraging stories that we heard were in smaller churches that have instituted some of this stuff. And that's just really exciting because sometimes there's this narrative that, oh, well, that only works at a certain size church or because you got this budget or whatever. And it's just cool. I would say almost sometimes this stuff maybe even works even better in smaller church because, sometimes, when a smaller church adds 20 or 30 people, that the impact of that can be felt even maybe more than a larger church.
Right. Man, I totally agree. I mean, I was so blessed to see some of the churches there that were smaller but were hungry. They wanted to see God do something in their community. We say it all the time at Breaking Barriers, like, we don't get to control what God does, but we do get to control what we're asking him to do. And, for some churches, that may be some massive number because they live in a massive place. And for other churches, it may be one, school that they want to do projects in, or it might be one ministry area focused in their church where they want to see some percentage growth. It may only be 10 people or a dozen people or whatever. So the numbers and the percentages aren't really that point. The point is like, man, do you have a vision for God doing more and more and more and more, and at least swinging for the fence, no matter if you're in, Lizard Lick, North Carolina, or you're in Charlotte, that shouldn't matter. Like, our hunger and drive should be there either way. And I think it's evidenced in what we're trying to do when we're trying to implement best practices, strategies. Man, we're looking forward. We're celebrating things that are happening that are exciting and growth oriented. The story that I think there were multiple stories like this, but one of the stories that I think you're referring to is this just thrilled my heart. I grew up in a church a little bit like this, where the guys in rural eastern North Carolina, churches grow, and I've said the numbers 2 or 3 different ways. I think I got them today. Maybe they were running like 130 or something, which is great. I mean, that's a normative size, for a church. But they were capped out. They got a small facility and all that. And this guy's been kind of leaning in with some things like this and just, we say church growth, but what that means is more people get saved and discipled. He's into that, right? So he wanted more people to get saved and discipled. And so he comes to their committees, because this is a traditional church, committees, deacon-led, all that stuff, comes to them and says, maybe we want to go to 2 services. And they told him no. Mm-hmm. We don't really do that. They're not interested in the chaos that's going to bring. I mean, just, you know how it is. I mean, anytime you're trying to grow, there's going to be chaos, right? So he gets a hold of the Breaking Barriers podcast that we did on why to go to 2 services. Mm-hmm. And just some of the motivations we have around leadership and giving people an opportunity to serve and serve one, attend one, and just all these spiritual inputs that we feel like come from having 2 services in people's lives. Sends them out to the deacon board and the committees or whatever. They come back to him and say, man, we were wrong. We should do this. And that is a miracle. That is like a Lazarus raised from the dead miracle, okay, to have a deacon board and all that stuff come back and say, hey, man, we think you were right. And next thing you know, man, they go to 2 services. I think the number was they're running 230, 240 now. And I mean, dude, you're talking about doubling, I mean, it's just the kingdom will be eternally different because of decisions that these guys made that were practical. Man, we're going to do what we can do, swing for the fence. I don't care that we're in eastern, rural, wherever. That doesn't matter. It doesn't matter that it's not 2,000 people. None of that matters. What matters is the pastor had a vision that for God moving in their church and moving in his heart, and they wanted to put pragmatics with it. And I just thought it was a cool story.
Yeah, I heard stories like that too, and it's on the face of it, I think it's almost like hard to believe because people are like, you're telling me this really basic church growth principle, right? Of like, hey, we're going to use this weekend to invite more people, or we're going to go to 2 services. Like, man, that had that big of an impact. And the reality is, it's like, yeah, a lot of times it does, and I think part of maybe what's going on there is there has to be there's a belief side of that, there is like a preparing the jar side of it, where it's like, man, we're praying that God's going to do more. And it's not just the practical aspect of the service, but there's something I think that happens in the heart of the leaders when we say, hey, we're going to identify this weekend, or we're going to try to grow in this way.
Right.
Like, we showed that video that Clay, he's from this area, he shared during the conference, and he talked about, they were doing something at their church. I think it was maybe fall launch or something, and they just kind of directed themselves at like, man, we want to connect with more families. Like, we want this to be a way to, and that's exactly what happened.
Right.
Like on that same weekend, they had like the most amount of new families come to their church.
Yeah.
And they're a smaller church. And it's just like, man, when God does something in the heart of the leaders to then, because it's not just the practical little things we're doing, it's like I honestly just think it's the heart and the desire to grow ends up getting fleshed out in these things.
Yeah, because every decision you make to walk in one of these icky practical things we're talking about is a decision for people to decide it's about somebody that is new more than it is about us that have been here forever. I don't know that story in Eastern North Carolina, ins and outs of it. I'm not in that church, but I mean, I bet you part of that is this is a decision for the outsider. It's not for us. As long as we don't care about growing, we don't need 2 services. We're all taken care of right here.
Mm-hmm.
So you're pushing your people all the time through a lot of these different decisions to think about going out of their way to think about the outsider coming in. And I mean, it was crazy. One of the guys I was talking to at Breaking Barriers, okay, Wesleyan Church, he's a chicken farmer by day and a pastor by night. Seriously.
I love it.
They bring their team, dude, they're fired up. Smaller church, right? He came there was like 100 people. Now there's over 200 people. I said, man, you're on 2 services? He's like, 2? We're about to go to 3. I mean, they're just, and it's like, and they're in a very rural place, 30 minutes from here, 45 minutes from here.
Some people would say, well, you can't grow a church in that area.
Yeah. And you would almost just say like, well, it's the big church in Charlotte that's going to be hungry wanting to go to 3 services. They're all, and it's like, no, man, this guy, it doesn't matter where we land. Like, where your feet are, Jim Elliott, be all there. And this guy is just like, dude, he's been a pastor for a long time in another place, and God called him away. And it's like, where I am, I'm gonna be all in. And so we're gonna go as hard as we can after this small rural farming community, and that's what they're doing, and they're seeing fruit from it.
Yeah, that's awesome. Second takeaway is, we have been helped by so many churches across the years, and so anybody that has ever reached out to us and said, hey, can I pick your brain, or can we hop on a call? We've always been willing to do that. But it's not until the last couple of years that we've had a little bit more of a strategy to try to coach and help other churches. And so we've been kind of officially doing this for a couple of years now. And so we're starting to be able to see some of the results of, like those churches that went through the first cohort that we did even before the first Breaking Barriers conference. And I would just say the principle is like, you can get real motivated going to a conference, doing some new things in your church, and you'll see some fruit from that, like we're talking about. But the kind of long term, like, man, week in, week out, year in, year out, we're going to institute some of these principles. We're going to pray for growth. We're going to try to get better as leaders. We're going to try to do things with more excellence. We're trying to get our staff into the right roles. There's just something about the consistency of multiple years where some of those churches now, I think, are starting to see some really major breakthroughs. I mean, Josh Hyde was sharing it on stage with us at one of the panels we did after one of the talks, and it's like, man, their churches, I think they've been going for 12 or 13 years, but just in the last year, God's done some like really, really big stuff in their church.
Totally.
So it's like, and we have felt that, like sometimes you got to just like stick it out for 3 years.
Yeah.
And then after 2 years or 3 years, you start to really see the momentum.
Yeah, I mean, if you feel icky about growth and generosity and new people and numbers and all that, your people will, because you'll talk about it in a way that feels icky. And I think that when some of these guys get freed up from some of that, I think generosity is a good example. It's like, a church that has had a leader that felt guilt around sharing with their church the discipleship principles of generosity, because secretly in their heart, it was honestly just about getting their people to give. It wasn't about their heart. And so he felt shame in that, because he, quite frankly, probably should. He feels like a used car salesman because he is. He's trying to get them to buy.
Mm-hmm.
Well, all of a sudden, when he starts thinking about it the right way, and really, gets his heart right about it, and starts thinking about generosity in terms of his people's discipleship, he's going to start talking about it a different way. But it's going to take a long time for them to start thinking about it the way that he's talking about it. So. Yeah. I just think that's the knee jerk from conferences and stuff, is like, okay, we're going to do something differently. But if you don't stay the course, right, the power of it doesn't get down. It might get into your heart a little bit, but it doesn't get down in the organization. We used to say at Mercy Hill all the time, when Andrew, me, is tired of saying it, the staff has just heard it. And when the staff is tired of saying it, the congregation just heard it. And so I think that like you're saying is right. There's a staying power of, kind of institutional change that, things don't just change on a dime.
Yeah. Cause like there's one thing if like, hey, I want my church to have a better inviter culture, and it's like, okay, you institute some new principles for that. Well, it's not until like multiple years where your people catch the culture of that, and it becomes like their DNA, and that's what they're thinking about. That's when you begin to see that long-term change.
Yeah. I think the first year, whenever it was, 6 or 7 years ago, that we decided to go hard at Easter, because we hadn't done that. I think if we'd have told everybody to put a sign in their yard that says "Come to Mercy Hill on Easter" or "Jesus is risen," and then it's got a Mercy Hill thing, I just don't think we would have got nearly the traction.
Mm-hmm.
I'm not saying it wouldn't have been a good idea. I just think that, 5 years later, or whatever it is, 7 years later, of us at Easter time every year, I mean, the church is an organization. It's also an organism. From the organization side, saying, hey, guys, this is an all hands on deck. Everybody in. We're all inviting. You're not going to out-invite me. I'm going to invite 100 people. We got to go all in. Now, here's one way to do that. Here's these signs. And I mean, they all got snapped up. We did a whole reprint. They all got snapped up.
Right.
I just don't think we would have had that kind of buy-in year one. But something about over time, people hearing this is the strategy, this is what we do, and they begin to lean in.
That's good. Yeah. The third takeaway is I think there's something powerful in being around other like-minded people in terms of, I don't know, just creating more courage in us, honestly. Because, thinking about, if you're a pastor that you really want your church to grow, and so, you go to different conferences and then you get lectured almost like with this anti-church growth stuff. And even some of the people in your church end up kind of, picking up some of the culture of that stuff. You feel bad that you want to grow, and you're like, man, am I crazy? You could feel like you're on an island. And I think it was just cool being around these 53 other churches, where getting to see some of them realize, wait a minute, there's a lot of other people that want their churches to grow. You're not on an island. You're not crazy. You're doing the right thing. You're not filled with pride just because you want to see more baptisms next year. I think that kind of goes into kind of what we're trying to build too.
Yeah, and if you were filled with pride, the answer is not to not try to go baptize people.
Right.
The answer is never take your ball and go home from the mission.
Right.
The answer would be confess and repent, just like anything else, right? So I saw what you're talking about in my breakout. I did a breakout with just lead pastors. I think we mentioned that. And one of the guys asked a question around basically getting kind of fired up for 1 year goals and just trying to get his first steps. This church has been planted for a while. It's taken a beating, honestly. They're trying to get right on growing and going now, and almost asking some questions around a reboot, and some of that's tied into he's got a big 2025 vision. I think he wanted to see 25 baptisms in the year 2025.
That's awesome.
Well, I think it's awesome too. The problem is, in the wrong environment, you'd get a lecture because you said that out loud.
Right.
An absolute lecture. doctrinal integrity, how dare you,
Right.
the sovereignty of God and all this stuff. And I just think that there's power in like being in an environment where you're able to say out loud, okay, guys, we're setting a baptism goal for next year, and then you're like looking around to see if anybody's gonna throw stuff at you, and then they don't. I think it's kind of cool being in an environment where you're like, hey, we're gonna set a baptism goal, and I'm not about to catch a bunch of heat from this. I'm not gonna have people that automatically get high on the horse and start assuming things about me, which I feel like happens. Man, it's not that. It's just, hey man, we're trying to run. It's practical. This is the way I'm going to package our vision. And everybody's like, oh, here's some. And what happened was everybody was like, hey, here's some ideas around that. He also was dealing with some it's tough, man. They've had a tough road, and people were talking to him about some of the things that they've done to come out of a hard season. And I just thought it was a really cool moment at the conference where these guys were having that community and they were just speaking into each other's life.
Yeah, another takeaway that's pretty similar to that one, and you and I have benefited a ton from this over the years, and maybe this can be an encouragement for anybody listening to the podcast, is there's a real need for people in specific ministry roles to connect with other people in the same ministry roles. And, sometimes, just, I don't know, like if you're not a part of a network or for whatever reason, you just may not have that. And I could just tell there was just like so much hunger for that. Mm-hmm. I'm sure you felt that with lead pastors, but just getting questions, we have an executive team at Mercy Hill, so we kind of have multiple people in executive roles, and there was just so many executive pastors that came up, and they're just looking for other people to connect to because it can really speed up the learning process. Mm-hmm. Instead of having to go and just learn from your own mistakes, you can connect with other people and be like, hey, you guys have walked through this. What did y'all do?
Right.
You guys have done a church merger. Like, man, are there some tools? And it's like, yeah, there's some really kind of basic tools here.
Right.
Check this out. And that should just be an encouragement for everyone. We have been super blessed over the years to be in lots of really awesome cohorts, with cohorts of executive pastors, cohorts with lead pastors. And I know that's benefited you.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, I've been in incredible cohorts, and then I've been in really terrible ones, where you fly across the country and you're in it and you leave and you're just like, man, this is just, and the difference, of course, is you got to have some level of we're all rowing in the same direction with the guys that you're in the cohort with. Mm-hmm. If you're in a cohort with, you start talking, you got questions around church mergers, and immediately there is just this massive walls that go up because there are guys in the cohort that are so diehard against multi-site, and they don't even want that to be part of the discussion around mergers. Although
they're going to lecture you.
Yeah, those are the most successful mergers. 90% of them work, but we can't talk about that one, right? So we got to do something else. And they're usually some wacky idea about how to
right.
Rebrand and do some church on Tuesday nights or whatever. And if you can't say it out loud without it turning into a big lecture. So my point is, I think that in some of these real learning environments, which that's what Breaking Barriers at its heart really is, mm-hmm. We're not really going after, that's why we said the word tribe. I almost don't want to say that because we're not really going after a network. We have a network, right. The Mercy Hill Family of Churches, soon to be the Mercy Hill Collaborative, that kind of thing. But it's what we have in Breaking Barriers is a training network. Mm-hmm. To be in a training network, you have to narrow the tent. If you have the widest tent in the world, what are you going to train people on? If you're going to train multi-site and half the guys there are like, we would never do that, right. So just by nature of it being a training network or a training cohort, I think the power is, yes, like what you said, you're getting around other guys in your role. There's a bit of an assumption. Churches are all different. I'm not saying they're all exactly the same, but around some of these bigger principles of growth, not going to be anti-multi-site, going to be talking about discipleship and generosity. There's some of the big questions are getting answered. Going to baptize people, those are questions that are already answered. So it gives you the freedom to connect with people and actually learn from them.
Yeah. Yeah, totally. That's great. All right. The very last one, and I'll try to be a little bit funny with this one. So we did the conference. I got a lot of feedback from people. I mean, multiple people said, hey, this was the most practical conference I've ever been to in terms of not just motivation and inspiration, but like practical tools about growing and multiplication. But the funny thing is, doing surveys and stuff and getting feedback from the conference, we had a lot of people say, man, they wish it was even more practical,
Right.
which I think you and I both kind of know, like, man, that is what we're trying to do, because conferences and whatever you want to call it, teaching networks, learning communities, whatever, there is just a void of stuff that's just not that practical, right? I mean, you can go to an infinite amount of conferences where somebody's going to try to inspire you, or they're going to challenge you, or they're going to try to motivate you. But like, hey, what's the roadmap for going to 2 services?
Right.
Like, is there a document you can share with me? And yeah, I think that's maybe a challenge to us, to breaking barriers, and an encouragement that,
Right.
man, we want to even do more of that.
Yeah. I think that there's hopefully going to come a day when the tools kind of begin to take over. I think right now we're still trying to figure out get our finger up with, lick your finger, put it and try to figure out where the wins are, because, you can have all the tools in the world, but if people inherently reject them as icky, then it kind of don't matter. And so I think what we're trying to do is constantly be casting a pro-growth vision, pro-growing and going vision, while lacing in and layering in a lot of the different tools that we use. And I think the conference did a decent job of that. I know both of us, and certainly the deep dives that we did, that's what it was intended to be, less philosophy and more like, hey, how do y'all do this? Certainly the breakouts were that way. But yeah, our main stage talks, I think, were pretty philosophical. And so I think it's a good challenge to us to continue, not just us, but like in our private Facebook group, to continue to share with one another. We just got so much, like we were talking about that checklist, y'all were talking about like the campus checklist and stuff like that. Yeah. I mean, those guys at Grace Church in Marion, I mean, they've taken that beyond and run with it. And I would say they've taken it beyond where we are. In fact, I think they kind of have, in terms of they've simplified it to where it's very workable. Those are great. I mean, like, man, pop that up in the Facebook group. Those are really practical things that we can continue to be challenged to do.
Yeah, and I think a challenge for us would be, when it's different doing something yourself and then trying to teach somebody else to do it, because you realize very quickly, like in our Facebook group's a really good example, and hopefully we have way more of this in the future. We may do something at Mercy Hill and someone says, hey, man, do you have a document or do you have something? And we don't, though, you know what I mean? Because it's different. Like, it just internally, like, okay, for whatever reason, like, we figured out how to do this or whatever, but we don't have it written down anywhere. And so hopefully in the future, as we see a lot of the similar questions, around growing 2 services, volunteer culture, generosity, hopefully, as part of Breaking Barriers, we can just develop more tools and stuff to be able to share with people. And the goal all along is just like, man, we want to see leaders grow and we want to see churches grow, because we know when they do, this is what Pastor Jonathan got into in his talk, it's going to create kind of the chaos of multiplication, and it's going to create sending ultimately.
I said this in my talk, and I think it's really true. And I think what you're saying in our surveys really bring this out, and it needs to be like a good wake-up call for all types of ministries that are trying to equip the church, that what we do is we bifurcate front of stage conversations, backstage conversations. And we've done this just forever. So, forever. I don't know. Since I was not around in the 80s and 90s, sounds like maybe they had flipped this, but my ministry life, it's always been this way, that you go to a conference or you go to something and you get front stage, which means it's going to be about, sending, diversity, fostering adoption, discipleship, going deep, preaching, whatever. It's going to be about something like that. The backstage conversations are more about the engine of the church that all the growing churches do, but they don't talk about.
The mechanism.
Yeah.
Trellis.
How do you actually take a first-time guest through something? What happens when somebody gives at your church for the first time? What systems are you using for that? What is Mortarstone? That conversation is massive, but what people have called that is backstage because it smells like growth. People don't like that, so we shy away from it. What we're trying to do at Breaking Barriers is just kind of blow that up and say, like, man, those surveys show you what guys need many times is the backstage conversation.
Yeah.
That's why they're coming to the stuff.
Right.
And so we just need to do better with that.
That's great, man. Let's leave it there. Hopefully this was helpful. If there are other topics you want us to kind of dive into and talk about, reach out to us. You mentioned the Facebook group. Check out our Facebook group. We're really trying to grow that, and people really help each other. Like this Facebook group, sometimes somebody will ask a question and we won't have a specific tool, and then somebody else in the group will link an article or they'll link a tool that's just like super helpful for everybody. So thanks, guys.
All right, thanks.